The clink of glasses echoed through the private dining room, the same Salt Lake City restaurant where my family gathered once a year to remind me of my place. I had just settled into my chair when my older sister, Victoria Vicky Carter, rose gracefully, a small remote in her hand. She tapped it, and a slide glowed against the far wall, bold black letters reading "Rent Adjustment." Her smile was polished, the kind of smile that told you she'd rehearsed this moment. "The rent on the family home is now $8,800, she announced, her voice sweet enough to sting. "It's just business, Emily. If you can't manage it, maybe it's time you find somewhere smaller, more suitable." For a moment, silence hung in the air, then broke with laughter. My father, Richard Carter, leaned back in his chair, proud of her poise. "Responsible decision," he said, his fork tapping against the rim of his plate like a judge with a gavel. My mother, Margaret Maggie Carter, leaned toward an aunt, her whisper carrying across the table. Finally, someone set boundaries. Their eyes glittered with amusement, the kind of amusement that had always cut deeper than open cruelty. I wrapped my hand around my water glass, gripping so tight my knuckles blanched. I did not argue, did not shout, did not beg. I had learned years ago that those reactions only fed their smirks. Across the table, Vicky watched me, her head tilted, her expression polished with pity. She expected me to fold, to scribble my name on her contract and accept the humiliation as I always had, but inside me, the silence was not surrender. It was a shield. I had carried something for years now, something they had never imagined I could hold. As the laughter circled the table like knives passed from hand to hand, I let my lips twitch into the faintest of smiles. They believed they had cornered me. They believed this night was theirs. But I was already holding the one truth they couldn't control. When I was a child, the family dinners were just as loud as they are now, only the applause was directed at someone else. My sister, Victoria Vicky Carter, 4 years older than me, was the center of every story. She carried her report cards into the dining room like golden tickets, each one lined with perfect grades. My parents, Richard and Maggie Carter, treated them as proof they had done something right. Richard would clap her on the shoulder with a booming, "Outstanding work, Vicky. You'll make this family proud." While Maggie's eyes glowed as if her daughter had single-handedly elevated the Carter name in our neighborhood. Meanwhile, I sat at the same table, pushing peas around my plate, waiting for my turn. I didn't bring home perfect grades, but I brought home something else, lines of code stitched together late at night on a second-hand computer. I thought, foolishly perhaps, that they might care to see once when I was 8. I showed them a little maze game I had built, a square cat chasing a pixel mouse through twisting hallways. Vicky glanced once, smirked, and went back to polishing her debate notes. Richard barely looked at the screen. "Games don't get you into college, Emily," he said. Maggie added without looking up, "Your sister is already on the honor roll. Try harder." I didn't cry. I just turned off the monitor and told myself maybe next time. But the next time was the same. By 12, I entered a local coding contest, staying up night after night to polish a small program that tracked weather patterns. I won 3rd place and came home clutching a certificate and a $50 gift card. That night at dinner, Vicky was reading aloud a letter from a prestigious summer program that wanted her. The room buzzed with their excitement. I slid my certificate across the table toward my mother, heart racing for even a glance of pride. She looked down, then passed it back. "That's nice, Emily, but 3rd place." She turned back to Vicky. My father didn't even pause his praise. Vicky leaned back in her chair, folding her arms, her smile a half curve that told me everything I had lost before I even began. That was the first brick in a wall that would rise between us. I wasn't jealous. Not exactly. I didn't want her spotlight, just a small flame of my own. But in that house, if you weren't Victoria, You were nothing more than a shadow, and shadows don't get applause. On weekends, when the weight of our dining table applause became too heavy to bear, I drove to the suburbs where my grandmother, Eleanor Ellie Hayes, lived in a modest brick house that always smelled faintly of peppermint. Her living room was cluttered with old technology magazines stacked in lopsided towers, dog-eared books on startups, and a laptop so ancient its keys stuck. But to me, it was a kingdom. Ellie would greet me with a chipped mug of peppermint tea, her eyes crinkling as if she'd been waiting just for me. "You're building something real, Emmy," she'd say, leaning in as I explained the projects I was tinkering with. Unlike my parents, she didn't ask about grades, trophies, or resumes. She asked about the glow in my eyes when I solved a problem, the way I lit up describing lines of code. In that space, I wasn't the shadow of Victoria. I was simply myself. One Saturday, Ellie pulled out an old folder, her hands trembling just slightly but her gaze sharp. She laid out yellowed brokerage statements, showing me tiny investments she had made decades earlier. "I put a little in Apple, a little in Microsoft," she said, tapping the faded numbers. "People thought computers were a fad. I thought they were the future." I studied the papers, not quite understanding everything, but feeling the weight of what she was sharing. She spoke of patience, of building steadily, of seeing potential where others saw nothing. "Don't wait for permission. Emmy, build your own path," she told me. Her words landed like seeds I didn't know I was already prepared to water. By 16, I was spending entire weekends at her house, bent over that old laptop while she sat nearby, reading aloud from books about venture capital or asking simple but piercing questions about my projects. She never once told me I was wasting time. She believed in me with a certainty that made the noise at my parents' house fade. If only for a little while. Then came the day she called me into the living room, her face pale but her expression steady. She handed me a folder heavier than its paper should have been. Inside was a trust in my name. With $300,000 set aside. "It isn't a fortune," she said, her voice firm despite her frailty. "But it's enough to start something. Don't tell your parents. And don't tell Victoria. This is for you. Build your future, not theirs." I sat frozen, the folder pressing into my lap, the weight of her faith heavier than the numbers themselves. I promised her I would use it wisely. Months later, when she was gone, I sat in that same living room alone, the mug of peppermint tea cold on the table. The silence was crushing, but her voice remained, echoing like a commandment. Build your own path. After Ellie passed, the house felt different. It wasn't just the quiet, or the absence of her peppermint tea on the side table. It was the way my sister, Victoria Vicky Carter, stepped forward as if she'd been waiting all along. The home where I had once found scraps of comfort became something else under her watch, a stage where she could prove she was in control. The house was technically held in the Carter Family Trust, with my parents, Richard and Maggie, as trustees, but in practice, it was Vicky who handled everything. She spoke in polished phrases: asset management, long-term stability, maximizing value. The kind of words she knew impressed Richard and soothed Maggie. They nodded at her as if she were the only one capable of steering the family's legacy. One evening, she slid a document across the kitchen table, her manicure glinting under the overhead light. "It's time we formalized this," she said, her tone warm but unmistakably firm. The paper was my lease for the house I had grown up in. $2,500 a month, with penalties for late payment, maintenance clauses, and even stipulations about keeping the property's value intact. I remember staring at the paper, my chest tightening. "This is my home too," I whispered. Vicky tilted her head, her smile gentle, rehearsed. "And it still can be. Emily, but structure is necessary. You'll thank me later." I signed. My hands shook, but my bank account was thinner than my pride. Freelance work in software development kept me afloat, but Salt Lake's rental market was brutal, and moving out wasn't an option. Vicky knew this. She counted on it. The months that followed were measured in invoices, on the first of each month. An email arrived from Vicky with a subject line that read simply, "Rent due." The language inside was cold, formal, as if I were a stranger leasing an apartment in some faceless complex. Payment must be received by 5:00 p.m. Late fees will apply. 1 month, a client's check was delayed, and I was a day late. I came home to find the Wi-Fi dead. My router lights blinked lifeless when I asked her. She shrugged from the living room chair where she sat scrolling her phone. Rules are rules. Get it together. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many more humiliations I could stomach. But the worst cut came when I tried to reach for help. I went to Richard and Maggie, hoping they might see reason. "She's charging me rent in Grandma's house," I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts. Richard didn't even frown. "She's being responsible." "You should be grateful she's managing things," Maggie added softly, almost smugly. "Not everyone is as disciplined as your sister. Learn from her." I stood there in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Ellie used to hand me peppermint tea and remind me to dream, and I realized my parents would never take my side. They saw Vicky's rules not as cruelty, but as leadership. Their approval had always been hers. Now their silence was too. And I understood then this wasn't just about rent or money. It was about power, about who was allowed to belong and who was forced to prove themselves every single day. I found myself in a small cafe one evening, the kind with cracked leather booths and the smell of espresso clinging to the air. Across from me sat Rachel Miller, my best friend from college and now a lawyer sharp enough to slice through the kind of knots my family tied around me. I wrapped both hands around a steaming mug of peppermint tea, the warmth steadying me while Rachel scribbled notes on a napkin. "You don't need their permission to breathe," she said plainly, her eyes lifting to meet mine. "The way she's treating you, it isn't management. Emily, it's leverage. You can either keep shrinking, or you can build something that puts you out of reach." The words echoed Ellie's voice. Decades softened, but still alive. Build your own path. That night, we began sketching what would become North Star Apps LLC. It wasn't grand or flashy at first, just a name on paper. A company funded with the trust Ellie had left me. I transferred the money quietly into a business account. Each transaction a small rebellion I kept hidden from my parents and from Vicky. The early months were grueling. I coded until dawn, building simple tools for local businesses' inventory trackers, appointment schedulers, the kind of programs that kept mom-and-pop shops running. Each small paycheck felt like proof that I wasn't as invisible as my family had always claimed. I lived frugally, rationing every dollar so North Star could grow while I still paid the rent Vicky demanded. Rachel laid out the legal structure in simple words I could cling to. "This company isn't just work, Emily. It's cover. It shields your assets. It builds credit. It gives you leverage. One day, it can hold more than code." Her eyes sharpened. "It can hold the house." I nearly laughed when she said it. The idea so absurd it felt like fantasy. But Rachel only folded the napkin, tucking it into her briefcase as if the plan was already set in stone. For now, I kept quiet, kept working, and kept paying Vicky's invoices as though nothing had changed. To her, I was still the little sister she could corner with contracts and penalties. But under the surface, the ground was shifting, and for the first time, I began to imagine what it would feel like not to sign another one of her contracts ever again. Vicky thrived on appearances, at family gatherings. She spoke about the house as though she were some seasoned real estate mogul. "It's all about market discipline," she would say, swirling her wine glass, her voice carrying just enough authority to make Richard nod in approval. Maggie beamed beside her, proud of the daughter who kept the family assets healthy. My aunts and uncles followed along, their silence a chorus of agreement. In their eyes, Vicky was responsible, decisive, the one holding us all together. In reality, She was holding me down, but that was the part no one wanted to see. Meanwhile, my world was changing in ways they couldn't imagine. North Star Apps was slowly taking shape. I had landed 3 contracts in the span of a year, enough to hire a junior developer to handle the smaller projects. My days were long freelance work to keep the rent flowing, coding all night to build North Star, but they carried a momentum I had never known before. Each signed invoice, each new client, was like oxygen. Still, I stayed silent at those dinners, letting Vicky gloat about her role as manager of Grandma Ellie's house. I watched her rehearse lines about insurance increases and property taxes as if she'd personally kept the roof from caving in. I bit my tongue, because the secret I held was too fragile to reveal too soon. Then came the escalation. One evening, Vicky appeared at the dinner table with a folder tucked under her arm, her lipstick perfect, her tone measured. "The market has shifted," she declared, "to keep pace with property values. The rent will need to be adjusted." She slid the paper toward me with the same smoothness as before. $8,800. I felt my stomach twist, but not from surprise. She thought this would be her masterstroke, the moment she would push me out once and for all. Richard called it necessary foresight, and Maggie added, "Emily, you should be proud your sister takes these things so seriously." I looked at their faces, my parents' admiration, my sister's smug certainty, and wondered which was worse, to be robbed openly, or to be patted on the head while it happened, for the first time in years. Though, I wasn't afraid of their laughter, because soon enough, they would learn who really held the deed. The private dining room buzzed with conversation, silverware clinking against porcelain, laughter bouncing from one end of the table to the other. I had been here many times before, but never with my pulse so steady. I knew what was coming. I had rehearsed it in my head for months. My sister, Victoria Vicky Carter, stood with her usual grace, a slim remote in her hand. The screen at the end of the room flickered to life with a polished presentation bar graphs, bold headings, charts that meant nothing but looked official. She smoothed the front of her blazer, her smile glowing. "The rent on the family home is now $8,800 a month," she announced, her voice gentle, almost sympathetic. "Emily, if you can't manage it, then perhaps it's time you look for a place better suited to your situation." A ripple of chuckles moved through the room. My father, Richard Carter, leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed with satisfaction. "That's foresight. That's responsibility." My mother, Maggie, leaned toward an aunt and whispered, "Finally, she's bringing order." Their laughter cut sharper than knives. I didn't touch the contract Vicky slid across the table. The pages were thick with clauses, designed to trap me. She expected me to fold, as I always had, to sign, to submit, instead. I pushed it back with one hand, my voice calm and even. "I'm not signing this." The laughter halted, the air thinning in the sudden silence. Richard's fork hovered in midair. Maggie's smile froze. Vicky tilted her head, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "What do you mean?" Maggie asked, her tone sharp with disbelief. I looked straight at Vicky. "You don't own the house." For a moment, the room seemed to shift. My cousin Ryan glanced around nervously. My aunt's brow furrowed. Richard's jaw tightened, though he tried to mask it with a dismissive chuckle. "Don't be ridiculous," Vicky snapped, her polished veneer cracking at the edges. She gestured toward the screen, her voice rising. "I manage the property. These are the numbers. Sign the contract. Emily, or move out." I stood, matching her height. "You've been collecting rent for years on something you don't control." Richard slammed his glass down, his face turning red. Maggie opened her mouth, but no words came out. The weight of the room pressed in, all eyes on me, and then the door swung open. The sound of heels against the hardwood floor carried like a drumbeat. Rachel Miller stepped inside, her expression cool, a folder in her hand. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like glass. She walked straight to the table and placed the folder in front of Vicky. "This is the recorded deed. Title belongs to North Star Apps LLC. Emily is its sole owner. She purchased the house 2 years ago." The color drained from Vicky's face as she flipped through the page's official seals, notarized signatures, bank records. Richard sputtered, "What nonsense is this?" Maggie's eyes darted from the documents to me, her composure breaking. Rachel laid out each sheet deliberately. "It's all here, ironclad. You've been collecting rent on a house you don't own. That ends tonight." The silence that followed was heavier than the laughter had ever been. My uncle cleared his throat. My cousin's fork clattered onto his plate. Vicky's shoulders sagged as she gripped the edge of the table, her polished smile gone. I looked at her once, then let the words fall like a verdict. "You can stop invoicing me now." No one laughed. No one spoke. The only sound was the steady beat of my own heart, louder now than all their voices combined. The first time I walked back into the house after the truth had been laid bare. The air felt lighter, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. No invoices, no contracts, no silent judgment hung over the walls anymore. It was mine now, truly mine, and for the first time, I could see what it could become. I started with the windows. Contractors came in, pulling out the heavy drapes and replacing the dim panes with wide glass that let the sun flood the rooms. Light poured into the living room where Ellie had once sat with me, her peppermint tea steaming on the side table. Now the space was open, warm, a place that invited breath instead of stifling it. I cleared the outdated furniture, stripping away years of someone else's control. In its place, I added clean lines, soft colors, and a reading nook by the window, a small sanctuary where I could sit with a mug and remember the woman who had believed in me long before I believed in myself. Down in the basement, I saw opportunity. I renovated the space into a studio apartment, modest but comfortable, and listed it for rent to local professionals. The income covered maintenance costs and then some. It felt fitting turning what Vicky had once wielded as a weapon into a tool that gave me freedom. At the same time, North Star Apps grew. I hired another developer, then a part-time bookkeeper to keep us steady. We worked out of a small rented office downtown, our walls lined with whiteboards scribbled full of ideas. Each paycheck I signed carried a weight that wasn't just financial. It was proof that I had created something lasting, something real. Every change I made to the house, every step forward with North Star, felt like a piece of Ellie's legacy coming alive. Her trust had been more than money, it had been belief. And I wanted this house to reflect that. One evening, I placed her chipped mug on a shelf in the kitchen, just above the new kettle. The peppermint steam rose again, curling into the air. A reminder and a promise. This was no longer a place of humiliation. It was a place rebuilt on my terms. Autumn dusk settled over Salt Lake City the evening I stepped outside to look at the house from the street. The windows glowed warmly, spilling golden light onto the sidewalk, and for the first time in decades, I didn't feel like an intruder staring at someone else's home. It was mine without contracts, without conditions, without anyone else's permission. A neighbor waved as she carried groceries up her steps, and I lifted a hand in return. It was such a small gesture, ordinary and quiet. Yet it reminded me how extraordinary it felt to stand here without shame tethered to my name. I thought of the years I had spent at this very table, invisible while Vicky was praised, silent while Richard and Maggie measured worth in grades and trophies. I thought of Ellie's voice urging me to build my own path, of the chipped mug of peppermint tea that had steadied me more than once. The girl who used to hide behind a flickering computer screen was gone. In her place stood someone who had built a company, reclaimed a house, and more importantly, set a boundary that no one in my family could cross again. I didn't need their applause. I didn't even need their understanding. What I needed was here a quiet street, a house filled with light, and the knowledge that I had finally stepped out of their shadow, and as the last traces of daylight slipped behind the mountains, I spoke the only truth that mattered. Cold and final, I didn't go back for love. I went back so they'd have to stop lying.